The grand hall of the Sunfire Citadel had been built to impress. Gilded pillars stretched 40 feet toward a vaulted ceiling, painted with the likenesses of Southern Alpha's past, their golden eyes rendered in precious pigment, their expressions fixed in eternal self-congratulation. 300 candles burned in the iron chandeliers overhead, and their light caught the facets of every jewel worn by every noble who had crowded onto the marble floor to witness the bonding ceremony of Aria Voss and Calder Ashvale, Supreme Alpha of the Sunfire Realm. They would not witness a bonding ceremony. Aria stood at the center of the room in a gown the color of winter white, her dark hair pinned in elegant coils above the graceful line of her neck. She was still. The kind of still that a blade is still in the half-second before it falls. Her green eyes did not widen. Her lips did not tremble. She simply watched Calder Ashvale turn his back on her in front of the assembled court and extend his hand, palm up in the traditional gesture of transferred favor, to his stepsister, Maren, who stood near the eastern pillar in a gown that had clearly been prepared days in advance. The hall had gone silent in the way that rooms go silent when something terrible is being done, slowly and publicly. Everyone was waiting for Aria to cry. Calder's voice carried easily in the hush. His tone was the polished, bored tone of a man announcing a minor schedule change. He said that the mating bond between himself and Aria Voss was hereby dissolved. He said that the pureblood healing gifts of House Voss were being formally redirected, by his authority as Supreme Alpha, into the bloodline most in need of them. He said that Maren had a condition, a weakness in her wolf spirit that required the fortification only a pureblood healer's bond could provide. He said that Aria would understand, because surely she, above all people, knew the importance of placing power where it was most needed. He did not look at her once while he said any of it. The court watched Aria with the hungry, glittering attention of people who had come expecting a feast and found themselves receiving exactly that, only not the course they had anticipated. They wanted tears. They wanted a beautiful woman's face to crumple. They wanted her to step forward, voice-breaking, and beg. That was the story they had built in their minds from the moment Calder had whispered the plan to his inner circle, and someone, inevitably, had talked. Half this room had known what was coming before Aria had walked through those gilded doors. Aria had also known. She had known for 4 days. She had spent those 4 days making very quiet, very thorough preparations. And now she stood in the silence of the grand hall and let a slow smile spread across her face. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile worn by someone who has just watched an elaborate trap spring shut on the person who built it. "Of course," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried. "I understand completely." She saw Calder's shoulders relax. She saw Maren's painted mouth curve upward. She saw the ripple of confused relief moving through the court as the expected scene failed to materialize, and people began recalibrating for a graceful, civilized humiliation instead. Aria reached into the hidden seam of her white gown, a seamstress's secret she had arranged herself, and closed her fingers around the focusing shard she had carried to every resonance chamber in the Citadel over the past 4 days. It was a small thing, pale and crystalline, no larger than her thumb. The court had never seen one because focusing shards were a relic of old pureblood technique, predating the Southern Realm's careful, systematic dismantling of any healer knowledge that its alpha lords could not control. She pressed her thumb against the shard's sharpest edge until she felt the sting of her own blood. The responding pulse of her power was not subtle. Aria had spent 22 years learning to keep her magic small and contained, to present only the acceptable, manageable face of her abilities. She released that discipline entirely in the span of 1 breath, and the healing magic that erupted through the focusing shard was the truest, most unfiltered expression of what she actually was. It was vast. It was white and silver and cold as the light before a storm. and it slammed down through the floor of the grand hall and through every channel and resonance node she had spent 4 days carefully, precisely mapping. The Sunfire Citadel's magical core detonated. The sound it made was not an explosion in the conventional sense. It was more like a bell the size of a mountain being struck once. A single concussive note that Aria felt in her back teeth and her sternum. Every window in the hall shattered simultaneously. The candles in their chandeliers guttered and died. The golden pigment in the painted ceiling above cracked and fell in drifting, sparkling sheets. And Calder Ashvel, Supreme Alpha of the Sunfire Realm, dropped to his knees on the marble floor as the power he had accumulated over years of political consolidation, every scrap of dominance and magical authority stored in the Citadel's core that bore his bloodline's imprint, was gone. Stripped. Burned clean. He would not recover it in a month. He might not recover it in a year. Aria turned away from him before he hit the marble. She did not give him her face. She did not give the screaming, scrambling court her face. She walked through the chaos at a pace that was calm, because she had planned this, and panic was an indulgence she had decided not to afford herself. She reached the northern balcony as the emergency ward lights along the Citadel's corridors flickered on in their weak, amber imitation of the real magical systems that were now completely offline. The balcony door was unlocked. She had unlocked it that morning. She stepped through it and was immediately struck by cold that had no relation to the pampered southern winter she had lived in for 22 years. The Winterbane border began less than a mile from the Sunfire Citadel's northern wall, a geographic fact that southern cartographers traditionally rendered in ominous red ink, with warnings about hostile magical environments and uninhabitable terrain. What they meant, translated out of their self-serving language, was that the North did not belong to the South, and never had, and everything beyond that border would kill a Southerner who wandered into it unprepared. Aria was prepared. She had waterproofed her boots. She had sewn a second layer of insulating wool into the lining of her gown. She had a direction. She had a plan. She looked down. The drop from the northern balcony to the Citadel's outer sloped roof was 20 feet. From the outer roof to the ground was another 15. From the ground, open snowfields stretched toward the tree line of the Winterbane borderlands, with nothing to recommend it except the fact that it was not inside the Sunfire Citadel, where the sound of shouting was already building back toward the hall. Aria stepped onto the balcony railing, balanced there for one precise moment, and jumped. She hit the outer roof and rolled the way she had practiced on the lower training levels, absorbing the impact through her shoulder and thigh rather than her ankles. Snow sprayed around her. She slid 4 feet down the slope and caught herself on a drainage fixture, hung for a half second, and dropped to the ground. She ran. The cold came at her like a physical thing, not a temperature, but a presence. The Winterbane border's magical climate pressing against the warmth of the Sunfire realm with centuries of accumulated territorial force. She felt the moment she crossed it, a snapping sensation across every nerve ending, and then the temperature dropped so dramatically that her first breath on the other side was more ice than air. Her next 5 steps were made in blizzard conditions that had not existed 10 seconds before. The storm did not build. It simply was, sudden and total, a white wall of wind and driving snow that reduced visibility to the length of her own arm. She kept moving. Direction by compass, a small magnetic one she had pressed into the wristband of her left sleeve. North by northeast, toward a specific landmark that she had cross-referenced in 3 separate accounts of Winterbane territory. A rock formation shaped like a broken crown, visible on the border's edge in conditions clear enough to see it. Conditions were not clear enough to see anything. Aria stopped tracking time and started tracking steps. 1,000 steps. 2,000. Her gown, for all its wool lining, was not built for a genuine Winterbane blizzard, and she knew it. The cold was getting into her extremities with a thoroughness that her preparation had delayed but could not prevent. Her fingers, wrapped in the thin gloves she had managed, were losing sensation. Her face was burning, and then numb, and then burning again. She made 4,000 steps before her legs gave out. She did not fall dramatically. She simply stopped being able to tell the ground from her feet and knelt in the snow because kneeling was the last option before falling. The blizzard was total around her, a roaring white nothing, and Aria knelt in the center of it and took stock of her situation with the same methodical honesty she had applied to every situation in the last 4 days. She was dying. Not immediately. But her core temperature was dropping past the point where moving would help, and she had no shelter, and the rock formation could be 20 feet away or 2 miles away, and she could not tell. She did not cry. She had nothing against crying in principle, but it required energy, and energy was not something she had in surplus. The darkness that moved at the edge of her vision was not the darkness of unconsciousness. It was a shadow within the storm, a mass that was too large and too solid to be a trick of the swirling snow. It moved toward her without sound, which was wrong, because something that size should have made sound, should have displaced air and crunched snow and been audible even over the blizzard. It was not audible. It was only visible when it was close enough that its size registered as wrong, fundamentally wrong, a bulk that filled the space between 2 points with a density that wolves did not have. Wolves were large. This was not a wolf the way a cave was not a room. It was enormous and dark-furred, and its red eyes, visible first and visible last in the storm's white chaos, were fixed on her with the flat, absolute attention of something that had not thought a human thought in a very long time. Aria knew what it was. Everyone in the Sunfire realm knew the stories. The Mad King of the North, Kael of Winterbane, lost to his bloodlust curse, a beast that had not returned to human form in 4 months by the last intelligence report she had read. A terror. A weapon too broken to aim. She also knew what she was. She was a pureblood healer with nothing left to lose and no one left to answer to, and the magic in her chest was still burning, spent and vast and desperate, and she was going to die in this snow in the next 30 minutes regardless of what she did. She raised her hand. Her arm shook from cold and exhaustion, and she raised it anyway, reaching toward the massive, lowered head of the beast as it came within arm's length and stopped, its breath a cloud against her face, its red eyes trained on her with the fixed attention of something deciding. Her fingers found the dense fur above its snout. She pressed her palm flat against the hard bone of its skull. She had nothing left to direct or modulate. What came out of her was not the careful, calibrated healing she had spent years performing for southern nobles who treated her gifts like a service they had purchased. It was raw. It was everything she had. It came out of her in a wave that should have dropped her entirely and would have, except that she was already on her knees. The red in the beast's eyes went out like a candle. What replaced it was pale gray, luminous and sharp, and deeply, immediately, intensely focused on her face. Not the flat attention of bloodlust. Something else. Something that had a quality she could not name quickly because she was losing consciousness, but that she registered with the last functional part of her analytical mind as recognition, which made no sense, because they had never met. She felt the warmth of his breath against her cold face. She felt the impossible gentleness of enormous jaws closing around her, careful as hands, lifting her from the snow with the complete, unhesitating certainty of something that had decided and would not be questioned. The blizzard raged. The beast walked north, carrying her, and the storm parted around him as if it knew better than to argue. Warmth was the first thing she understood, and warmth was wrong. Aria's last conscious memory was snow and cold and the absolute certainty of dying. So warmth required explanation. She catalogued it before she opened her eyes. Heavy furs over her body, the genuine kind, thick and dark, and layered with the particular weight of pelts from animals that lived in genuine cold. A fire somewhere to her left, close enough to feel on her cheek. A mattress that was firm and deep, and not the overstuffed southern confection she had slept on for 22 years. Stone ceiling above her when she finally opened her eyes, black-veined and high, carved at the edges with angular geometric patterns that had no equivalent in southern architectural tradition. She was in Winterbane Keep. She sat up slowly, taking inventory. Someone had removed her ruined gown and dressed her in a heavy linen shift that fit poorly because it had been made for a much larger frame. Her fingers were bandaged, the tips of them, where the frostbite had bitten deepest. Her feet were the same. She moved each hand experimentally and found that the damage, while real, had been addressed with competence. Someone here knew wound care. She looked toward the fire and found him. He stood at the far edge of the chamber's firelight, which meant he was standing in the part of the room that a reasonable person would have called shadow, which meant that he was using the full depth of a very large room and still taking up a significant portion of it. Aria had understood, on an intellectual level, that Kael of Winterbane was large. She had read the reports. 6.5 feet. Heavily built. The kind of physical scale that northern bloodlines occasionally produced in their alpha males after generations of brutal selective pressure. She had filed that information accurately and without particular emphasis. Looking at him now, she revised her assessment of her own filing system. He was enormous in the specific way that made the room seem like it had been built slightly too small. His shoulders were broad to the point of architectural statement, the muscles of his chest and arms visible even through the dark linen of his shirt, because linen, at that scale, had no choice but to describe what it covered. He was scarred across the left side of his jaw and throat, old white lines that had healed badly or been left to heal on their own, and his face beneath them was the kind of ruggedly structured that southern sculptors occasionally attempted and never achieved. His hair was dark and longer than southern fashion permitted, and his eyes, which had been red in the storm and were now the pale, clear gray she had glimpsed at the moment of contact, were fixed on her with the same total, unhurried attention a predator gives to something it has already decided about. He had not moved since she sat up. He was waiting for her. Aria had spent 22 years in a court that used observation as a weapon. She recognized waiting as a form of power assertion and declined to award it. She reached for the water pitcher on the bedside table, drank, set it back down, and then looked at him directly. "I owe you my life," she said. "I don't enjoy debt. I'd like to discuss terms for clearing it." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly, but a recalibration. He had expected something other than this, and she noted his adjustment as information. "Speak," he said. His voice was low and rough, the voice of someone who did not use it often and had not bothered to smooth it for company. "The curse on your bloodline," Aria said. "The one that took your wolf and left you with bloodlust. I know what it is. It's a severed bond, specifically a Pureblood Healer's bond, broken under duress, probably 2 or 3 generations back. The frayed end has been tangling in your bloodline ever since, getting worse with each generation because no one with the correct type of power has been willing to come near you." She paused. "I'm a Pureblood Healer, and I am currently without any prior obligations." He was very still. Stillness in a man that large was its own kind of pressure. "What you felt last night, when I touched you," she continued, "that wasn't a trick, and it wasn't temporary. That was one unguarded pulse of what a full healing bond would do for you. I can make it permanent. I can rebuild what was severed and give you full control of your shift again." She met his gray eyes steadily. "In exchange, I want sanctuary. Winterbane's walls and Winterbane's law, such as it is, protecting me from southern jurisdiction. And when I'm ready, I want an army, not permanently. I want it for a specific, finite campaign." The silence in the chamber was complete except for the fire. "The South," Kael said. "Calder Ashvale specifically," Aria said. "But yes, the South." He moved for the first time since she had woken, pushing off from the wall and crossing the room toward her, and she kept her face entirely neutral as he came close enough that his scale became fully, personally apparent. He stopped at the bedside, looking down at her with those pale eyes that had something in them now that she could not quite classify, something too layered to be simple and too intense to be comfortable. He breathed in slowly, almost deliberately, and she saw something change in his expression at whatever he found. His jaw tightened. His hands, which were large and scarred and hanging loose at his sides, closed briefly into fists and then opened again with visible effort. "Agreed," he said. It was the fastest negotiation Aria had ever concluded, and she had concluded several. The next weeks established the terms of living in Winterbane Keep, with a specificity that no negotiation had covered. The keep itself was severe in the way that northern architecture was severe, which was to say it was built for function and endurance rather than display, but it was not bare. The obsidian stone of the walls held heat in a way that southern marble never had. The furnishings in her given chambers were massive and dark and made of materials that had clearly come from significant distances. Heavy carved wood and iron and wool that had no southern equivalent. Her window looked out over the northern range, which was brutal and white and, on clear days, violently beautiful. Kael's people moved around her with the careful, watchful manner of wolves who had not decided what to make of her and were reserving judgment. They were not hostile. She had healed 3 of them in her first week, before she had fully intended to, simply because she noticed injuries and could not address them, and that had shifted something in the keep's general atmosphere. The soldiers made space for her in the corridors with a gravity that was not quite deference and not quite wariness, but somewhere in the narrow territory between them. Kael himself was a constant. She would look up from a text she was studying in the library and find him in the doorway. She would cross the training yard and feel his gaze on her back with the particular weight of something that was not casual. He did not crowd her. He maintained a specific distance that she eventually identified as the minimum he could manage, which was closer than most people considered appropriate but further than his obvious inclination. She mentioned the cold one evening without thinking about it. They were in the great hall after the evening meal, and the particular draft that came under the northern-facing door had found the gap between her collar and her neck, and she said, absently, that the northern wing ran cold. She said it the way a person observes weather. She did not mean it as a complaint. She was already mentally moving on to the properties of the ward restoration technique she intended to demonstrate for him the following morning. Kael was not there the next morning. He returned the morning after that, arriving in the great hall before dawn with no announcement. Aria heard the commotion from her chamber and came down to find 12 of his soldiers unloading something from iron-banded crates that glowed. Literally glowed. A pale, sustained amber light that pulsed slowly, like breathing, emanating from irregular crystal formations the size of her forearm. Each one radiated heat she could feel from 8 feet away. Each one was also, unless she was profoundly mistaken about her references, a thermal dragon crystal, which were native to the volcanic ranges 300 miles to the northeast, and harvested at exceptional personal risk, and traded for sums that she had, in another life, seen Southern Lords barter estates to acquire a single specimen. There were 17 of them. Kael's armor was dark with ash. It was in his hair and across the planes of his face and ground into the scarring on his jaw. He had fought something to get these, and had not bothered to clean up before bringing them to her, and when his eyes found hers across the hall, they held that particular quality that she was coming to recognize, an intensity that was entirely straightforward and therefore more difficult to handle than anything complicated would have been. "For the cold," he said. Aria looked at 17 thermal dragon crystals, casting their amber warmth across the obsidian floor of Winterbane Keep's great hall. She looked at the ash on the Mad King's jaw. "That was not necessary," she said. "It is done," he said, and turned to direct his soldiers on placement, apparently considering the matter closed. She had them arranged near her window and her reading chair and her work table, and for the rest of the winter her chambers were warm in a way that the Sunfire Citadel, for all its heated floors and spelled hearths, had never quite managed. She did not mention the cold again, because she had begun to understand that mentioning anything in Kael's hearing was a form of instruction, and she was not prepared to be responsible for what he might do in response to her offhand observations. The incident with the guard happened on a clear afternoon in the 3rd week. His name was Brennan, and he was one of Kael's senior soldiers, a compact, efficient man who trained the keep's younger wolves in the eastern yard. Aria had been watching the session from the yard's low wall, studying movement patterns for reasons that were entirely analytical. She had been considering the relationship between physical discipline and magical endurance. When the session ended and Brennan approached to offer a respectful nod, she had remarked, in the tone she used for accurate observations, that his footwork in the 3rd defensive sequence was genuinely exceptional. She had seen Southern champions with worse economy of motion. It was a factual compliment delivered without inflection. Brennan had gone very still in the specific way that people go still when they become aware that something large is behind them. Aria turned. Kael had crossed the yard without sound. He was standing at her shoulder, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at his face, and the expression on it was something she had not seen from him before. His pale eyes had gone dark at the edges, in a way she associated with his wolf pressing close to the surface, and the line of his jaw was tight, with a tension that was not anger exactly, but was something rawer and less governed than anger, something that had not run through the calculation of whether it was reasonable. Brennan had already excused himself, rapidly and entirely, in the manner of a man who valued his continued existence. "He placed you here," Kael said. His voice was lower than usual, rougher, the consonants not quite as controlled. "You should not be watching another man's body for an hour." Aria kept her expression level. "I was observing technique. It was professional." "You told him he was exceptional." "He is exceptional." It was accurate. Kael took a single step forward, and the wall was immediately at her back, the cold stone of it against her shoulders, and he was close enough now that the warmth radiating off him was a physical thing. Impossible given the temperature of the yard, but undeniable. He braced one hand against the wall beside her head, and the sheer fact of his arm, at that proximity, was its own kind of argument, the muscle of his forearm and the span of his hand speaking a language that was entirely physical and entirely clear. "Look at me," he said. She was already looking at him. She said so. "When you want to observe strength," he said, and his free hand came up not to touch her but to turn slightly, indicating himself with a restrained gesture that somehow contained more possessiveness than a direct grab would have. "Observe mine. Look only at mine." His gray eyes were very close and very serious and carrying an intensity that had no performance in it. This was not a display. This was the actual content of him, unmediated, the thing he was when he was not managing what he showed the world. Aria's pulse, which she had prided herself on governing for 22 years, did something she did not have a prepared clinical term for. "That," she said carefully, "is a somewhat unreasonable request." "I am not a reasonable man," he said, and she had the distinct, disconcerting impression that it was not a boast. It was an honest statement of fact, offered with the same directness he brought to everything, and the worst part, the part that she was not entirely prepared for, was that she had begun to find his specific brand of unreason difficult to look away from. The crystal warmth from her chambers seemed to follow her even into the cold of the yard, or perhaps, she thought with the part of her mind that was still analytical, it was simply him. The word arrived before the envoy did, the way bad news always travels faster than the people carrying it. A rider came through the Winterbane border crossing at dawn, alone and badly frostbitten, flying the Sunfire Realm's golden amber banner with the specific desperation of a man who understood that the banner might not be enough. He was brought to the keep's receiving hall within the hour, and he delivered his message to Kael's assembled war council, while Aria stood at the back of the room with her arms folded, listening. The message was, in summary, that the Sunfire Realm requested the return of the healer, Aria Voss, that her absence had created difficulties of a serious and escalating nature, and that Supreme Alpha Calder Ashvale himself would be arriving within 3 days to speak to the matter personally. The writer delivered this with the clipped, over-controlled diction of someone reciting words that he privately found embarrassing on behalf of the person who had written them. Aria said nothing during the message's delivery. She said nothing afterward, as the War Council discussed it in the blunt, pragmatic shorthand that Winterbane's officers used for everything. She waited until the room was mostly cleared, and then she told Kael's second-in-command, a broad-shouldered woman named Voss, who was no relation, and whose opinion of Southern diplomacy was unambiguous, that she wanted to be present when Calder arrived. Voss looked at her with the flat assessment she gave to most requests. "The king will have thoughts about that." "The king," Aria said, "is welcome to have thoughts. I'll be in the Eastern Yard." She was in the Eastern Yard when Kael found her, practicing the extended ward restoration technique on a damaged section of the keep's outer wall, because the work needed doing and she did not intend to stop being useful simply because her past was inconveniently inbound. She heard him approach, which meant he was allowing her to hear him, which was its own form of courtesy from a man who could cross a room without sound when he chose. "You will want to be present," he said. It was not a question. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The pale gray of his eyes in the winter light held something controlled and careful, a leash on something that was not controlled and not careful at all. "I want you to know," he said, "that I will not be governed by diplomatic convention when that man is in my gates." Aria looked at him. She thought about the rider's frostbitten hands and the apologetic curve of his shoulders while he delivered a message he found contemptible. She thought about Calder Ashvale's bored, polished voice in the grand hall announcing the end of her life as she had known it, not because he had to, but because she had been useful, and he had found something more useful, and the accounting had simply been updated. "I know," she said, and returned to the ward work, and did not tell him to restrain himself. Calder arrived on the afternoon of the 3rd day with an envoy of 30, which was an insult dressed as a courtesy. 30 men to Winterbane Keep was not a diplomatic party. It was a gesture, the Sunfire Realm's way of saying, "We do not consider this a serious military engagement. We consider this a retrieval." They rode through the outer gates in their amber and gold regalia, which was vivid and slightly ridiculous against the black stone of the keep's walls, and they arranged themselves in the central courtyard in the formation that Southern diplomatic protocol specified for formal demands. Calder had not aged in 2 months. He looked, if anything, more polished than he had in the grand hall, which suggested he had spent the intervening period around people who were still telling him what he wanted to hear. He sat his horse with the easy authority of a man who had not yet fully metabolized the information that his authority was substantially diminished, and when his gaze found Aria standing near the keep's main doors, something crossed his face that she identified with cold precision as relief. That was the most offensive part, that he was relieved to see her, as if she had been stored somewhere waiting for him to come and collect her, as if the intervening weeks and the life she was building in their wake were simply a temporary inconvenience in his schedule. She took a step forward. She had things to say. She had been composing them, in idle moments, for 2 months, and they were good. They were precise and devastating, and she had been looking forward to delivering them. She did not get the chance. Kael came through the main doors behind her, and the temperature of the courtyard changed in a way that had nothing to do with the northern wind. He moved without urgency, which was somehow worse than if he had moved with it, a slow and total and absolute crossing of the courtyard that parted Winterbane soldiers on either side the way water parts around stone. He was in no armor. He had not dressed for this in any ceremonial sense. He was exactly what he was every day, enormous and scarred, and radiating the kind of power that Aria's restored bondwork had returned to him in full. The pure alpha aura of the Winterbane bloodline at its undiluted peak, and 30 southern soldiers on 30 well-trained horses all had the same problem at the same moment, which was that their animals wanted to be somewhere else, and were being extremely clear about it. Calder's horse shied hard to the left. He controlled it, barely, and opened his mouth to speak. He said, "Aria, I have come to," and that was as far as he got. Kael's hand closed around his throat before the next word arrived. He did not reach up. He stepped forward and took Calder off the horse in a single motion, lifting him by the throat with the casual mechanical ease of a man picking up something that did not merit the use of both hands. And Calder's feet left the stirrups and left the air, and Kael was already moving, walking forward with that same unhurried pace, carrying the Supreme Alpha of the Sunfire Realm by the neck, the way one might carry a disagreeable object that needed relocating. The first wall did not slow him. It was a 6-inch partition of courtyard stone, decorative rather than structural, and Calder's body went through it with a sound like a thunderclap, debris scattering across the cobblestones in a radius that sent the Southern Envoy's horses into complete hysteria. Kael walked through the gap without releasing his grip. The second wall was thicker, load-bearing stone from the outer wing's original construction, and it fractured along 3 separate lines before it gave, and Calder made a sound on the other side of it that had no dignity whatsoever. The third wall was the outer courtyard's dividing barrier, 8 inches of Winterbane obsidian that had been standing for 200 years. It did not stand for another second. Calder hit the ground on the far side of it in a pile of black rubble and stayed there, which was the first intelligent decision he had made in 2 months. The dust settled slowly. 3 of his ribs were broken, Aria assessed from a distance, and his pride was in significantly worse condition. The Southern Envoy had stopped trying to control their horses and was instead managing their own reactions to the spectacle of their Supreme Alpha embedded in the rubble of Winterbane's outer dividing wall. Kael stood over him. He was not breathing hard. Calder looked up at him from the rubble with the expression of a man whose operational assumptions were undergoing rapid revision. Blood from a cut on his cheekbone was running into his collar. His golden ceremonial armor had not survived the 3 walls intact. He was, by any observable measure, thoroughly humiliated, and the 30 soldiers he had brought as a casual gesture were providing him no assistance whatsoever because none of them wanted to be next. "You will not speak to her," Kael said. His voice in the ruined courtyard was very quiet, which was far more effective than shouting would have been. "You will not look at her. You have no claim, no standing, and no welcome in my territory. You came here to take what is mine." From the doorway where she had remained, Aria considered objecting to the specific phrasing of that last sentence on principle. She decided, on reflection, that the moment did not require it. Calder spit dust and found something in himself that she supposed was either courage or stupidity, the two being difficult to distinguish in Southern alpha males. He said, from the rubble, that Kael had assaulted a head of state, that the Sunfire army numbered 40,000, that Kael had just started a war. Kael looked down at him for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved, just slightly, in something that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. "Good," he said. He turned and walked back through 3 broken walls and did not look at Calder Ashvale again. The Southern Envoy removed themselves from Winterbane territory within the hour, carrying their Supreme Alpha with them in a way that required 2 men and a horse rigged as a stretcher, which Aria observed from the eastern watchtower with the focused, quiet attention of someone filing information they had expected and still needed to confirm with their own eyes. She came down from the watchtower to find the keep already changed. The shift had happened in the hours since Kael had walked back through the broken walls, moving through the soldiers and staff and officers of Winterbane with the quiet, inevitable spread of certainty. In the war room, maps had appeared on the central table. In the armory, the sound of preparation was constant. In the corridors, Kael's generals moved with the particular efficiency of people who had been waiting for a specific order and had just received it. She found Kael at the war room table, with Voss and 4 senior commanders, and he looked up when she entered with those pale gray eyes that held, beneath their clarity and calm, the particular depth of something that had been decided and would not be revisited. "Tonight," he said. It was addressed to the room and to her simultaneously. She moved to the table and looked at the maps. The Winterbane border, the Sunfire territory south of it, the roads and strongholds and garrison positions marked in the Northern Command's careful notation. Calder's 40,000 had sounded like a threat in the rubble of the courtyard. On the table, against the full picture of what Kael had available, it looked like arithmetic. She looked up. "Your ribs," she said. He had taken the walls with Calder, but the force of them had not been entirely one-directional. She could see it in the way he was holding his left side. "They are fine," he said. They were not fine. She crossed to him and pressed her hand against his side without asking, and the healing came cleanly. The bond work between them now so established that it operated more like reflex than technique. She felt the 3 hairline fractures close, the bruising beneath reabsorb, and when she stepped back, his eyes were on her with an intensity that had temporarily suspended the entire War Council's participation in the meeting. "Now they are fine," she said, and looked at Voss and the 4 commanders. "Show me the southern garrison rotation at the first border stronghold." Voss showed her, and the meeting continued, and outside the war room windows the Winterbane keep was transforming itself from a fortress into a weapon. By nightfall, Kael stood in the outer courtyard before 3,000 of the North's most battle-hardened wolves. They were ranked in silence, which was more frightening than any battle cry, a mass of dark armor and controlled stillness that had the unified quality of a single organism waiting for direction. The torches along the keep's walls threw their light across upturned faces, and the cold of the northern air was absolute. Kael stood at their head with no speech prepared, because he had not needed to prepare one. He was Winterbane, and Winterbane did not explain itself. He released his alpha aura without restraint. Aria, watching from the keep's main steps, had felt it before, in pieces, in the contained form he used inside walls. She had not felt it uncontained, which was something she understood now she had been spared deliberately. 3,000 wolves felt it in the same instant, and the effect moved through them, like wind through a field, heads dropping in instinctive, unanimous acknowledgement, the sound of it a collective low note that was more felt than heard. He shifted. The massive dark wolf that stood where Kael had stood was the same beast she had met in the blizzard, except that the red was entirely gone from his eyes, and what remained was that pale, clear, terrible gray, fully present and fully sovereign, and nothing like the lost, bloodlust-driven creature that had haunted the North's border for 2 years before she had pressed her hand to his skull in the snow. He was whole. She had made him whole, and he moved to the head of his army with a power and control that made the torchlight seem brighter for a moment, as if the night itself was orienting. He looked back once before they moved. His gray eyes found her on the steps with the unerring accuracy that she had stopped being surprised by, and the look in them was not complicated. It was the same look he had given her the morning with the thermal crystals and the evening in the yard and 100 moments in between, absolute and single-minded and entirely uninterested in concealing itself. Then he faced south, and Winterbane moved. The army poured through the gates in a dark tide, and the sound of it was the sound of certainty. 3,000 wolves following a fully healed, fully sovereign Alpha King into a campaign that had, as its primary and unambiguous motivation, the satisfaction of one woman's right to exist untouched and unavenged no longer. The southern border fell before dawn. The dispatches that began arriving at the keep by mid-morning had the stunned, abbreviated quality of reports written by men who had not believed, until they saw it, that 40,000 could mean nothing. Aria read them at the war room table, one after another, and felt something in her chest that she had been carefully not naming for 3 weeks settle into its correct shape at last. The Sunfire Citadel smelled like defeat. It was a specific smell, Aria noted, as she walked through the shattered main gates on a gray morning 3 days after the southern border fell. Ash and cold stone and the particular staleness of halls that had been grand and were now simply large. The gilded pillars of the outer courtyard were intact, because Kael's army had been precise rather than indiscriminate, and precision was in some ways crueler than ruin. The building stood. The power that had filled it was gone, and the building stood as evidence of that absence, a beautiful shell that had been emptied and did not yet understand what it was now. Winterbane soldiers lined the courtyard in dark ranks. Still and silent, in the way she had come to understand, was simply how they stood, without performance or posture, just the real weight of what they were. The Sunfire Court's surviving nobles were present, because they had been required to be, and they stood in their diminished finery with the hunched, careful quality of people who were making rapid and thorough reassessments of every choice they had made in the past several years. Calder and Marin were in the center of the courtyard. They were kneeling, which was not a position either of them had occupied by choice. Calder's ceremonial armor was gone, replaced with plain wool that fit him badly. The 3 ribs Kael had broken had been set and bound, but he was still moving with the careful stiffness of someone for whom each breath was an argument. The cut on his cheek had scabbed without being properly cleaned, which said something about the quality of care available to him now that his Pureblood Healer was gone. Marin knelt beside him in a dress that had once been expensive and was now simply dirty, her manipulative beauty stripped to its base components by exhaustion and fear and the fundamental indignity of mud. They looked up when Aria stopped in front of them. She was wearing black and crimson, Winterbane's colors, and she had worn them deliberately. The black silk had a weight and quality that moved well, and the crimson detailing at the collar and cuffs was not decorative but functional, marking her rank in the Northern tradition's straightforward visual language. She was aware, exactly like what she was. Not a stolen prize. Not a retrieved asset. A woman who had walked into a blizzard and built something new on the other side of it. She looked at Calder for a long moment. She had thought, during the weeks of preparation and the march south, that she might have something she needed to say to him. She had rehearsed nothing, but she had wondered whether there would be words equal to the particular damage of being discarded by someone who had never actually seen you clearly enough to know what they were discarding. Standing in front of him now, she found she had less to say than she had expected. "You thought healing was something you could transfer," she said. Her voice was even and unhurried. "You thought it was a resource like gold or grain that could be weighed and redirected and assigned to the most advantageous account." She tilted her head slightly. "You were wrong about what it is, and you were wrong about what I am. Those are different categories of error, and I want you to understand that before I finish." Calder's jaw was working. There was something in his face that she recognized as the last of his pride trying to organize itself into a coherent objection, and she watched it fail. "Aria," he started, and the specific quality of his tone was the one she had been waiting for, the persuasive, intimate tone he used when he wanted something, the voice calibrated to the woman he had thought she was, pliable and invested enough in his approval to be moved by its withdrawal and restoration. "What was done to you was a mistake. The realm needs you. I need you. If you would simply consider." "I'm not considering," she said pleasantly. She pressed both hands together, the way she had learned from the old pureblood texts she had spent weeks studying in Winterbane's deep library, and then she drew them apart, slowly. What came out of her was not the unguarded wave she had released in the Grand Hall 2 months ago. It was precise. Surgical. The healing magic that she had spent her entire life being told was a gift to be administered at others' discretion, channeled now as its own opposite, not destroying but severing, finding the threads of stolen power that ran through Calder Ashvale's blood and removing them with the clean finality of a blade. He felt it. She could see him feel it, the color draining from his face as what he had accumulated over years of political maneuvering and magical inheritance was carefully, completely, and permanently withdrawn. Not burned, the way she had burned the Citadel's core. Taken, returned to the neutral state that magic found when it was no longer being directed by a bloodline that had earned it. When she turned to Marin, the stepsister's expression had already moved through several stages of protest and arrived at the hollow stillness of someone who understood that what was happening to her would not be stopped by anything she could say. Aria was not unkind. She was simply thorough. When it was done, Calder Ashvale and his stepsister knelt in the mud of their own courtyard as ordinary people, which was what they had always been underneath the borrowed architecture of their privilege. They had no magic, no claim, no position in any structure that Aria or Kael chose to build on these foundations. They were simply two individuals who would need, going forward, to make their own way in a world that had been reorganized around their irrelevance. Aria stepped back. She did not look at them again. Kael came to stand beside her, and the assembled court of the former Sunfire realm felt his presence as a physical fact. The alpha aura that he no longer restrained in any context rolling off him in the slow, constant way that mountains are tall, without effort, without pause, simply as a condition of existing. He was in his war commander's dark armor, and he had not bothered to remove the evidence of the campaign from it, ash and the marks of hard travel, because he was not here to impress the Sunfire court. He was here because she was here. He looked at her, not at the court, not at the kneeling figures, only at her, and the look in his pale gray eyes was something she had stopped trying to classify with clinical distance. She knew what it was. She had known for some time. "Come here," he said, quietly enough that it was meant for her alone. She took a step toward him, and he turned to face her fully, both of his large, scarred hands coming up to cup her face with the impossible gentleness he reserved exclusively for this, for her, the gentleness that the rest of the world never saw and would not have believed if told about it. His thumbs rested against her cheekbones, and his eyes were level with hers in the way she had grown to understand, as his form of equals, the deliberate physical adjustment of someone who never needed to assert height, but chose to meet her on her terms. He reached into the armor at his chest and removed something that he had been carrying there, which was the only place he would have kept something he intended to protect. The crown was not large. It was not ostentatious in the Southern style, not encrusted with gems or hammered into elaborate symbolic shapes. It was made from his own material, fang and bone from the beast he had been for 2 years when the curse had taken him, worked by Winterbane's master craftsman in the 3 days since the southern border fell, carved into a clean, angular circlet that caught the gray winter light with the specific luminosity of something that had come from something alive. It held the particular weight of something real, something that had cost what it cost and did not pretend otherwise. Kael placed it on her head with both hands, with the care of someone handling the most significant thing they had ever touched. Around them, the assembled court was silent. Winterbane soldiers and Sunfire nobles and the surviving staff of the Citadel and the riders and commanders who had made the march south, all of them witnessing something that had not been announced or rehearsed, something that was happening because it was true and truth, in Kael's understanding of things, did not require ceremony beyond itself. "Winter Queen," he said, his voice carried in the cold air of the courtyard without effort, the way his voice always carried, not through volume, but through a quality that silence made room for automatically. "Equal sovereign of the Winterbane Empire, co-ruler of what is and what will be, not given to me, not taken. Choosing." His gray eyes moved over her face with the unhurried thoroughness she knew by now meant he was memorizing. choosing this. The snow began to fall. It was not dramatic, not a blizzard or a storm. It was the quiet, steady snowfall of a northern winter that has decided to be present. Flakes coming down in the particular, unhurried way that suggested they intended to continue for some time. They caught in the crimson detailing of her collar, and in the carved bone of the crown, and in Kael's dark hair, and the cold was absolute and clean, and nothing like the cold of the Winterbane border on the night she had stumbled through it, dying. That cold had been an ending. This was something else. He still had her face in his hands. She brought her own hands up to his chest, feeling the solid weight of him beneath the armor, the warmth that he ran, regardless of temperature, the heartbeat under her palms that was steady and real, and had always beat this way. She understood now, even when she had only known him as a shadow in a blizzard. "You are not a reasonable man," she said, and there was something in her voice she did not try to modulate. "No," he agreed, and his mouth curved, the rare full version of that expression that she had seen more than anyone living, and still could not look at without her pulse doing its undisciplined thing. "You knew that when you chose." "I knew," she said. He kissed her. It was not a performance. There was no court in the moment it happened. No audience, no conquered citadel or falling snow or weight of everything that had led to this specific point in time. There was only the complete and unhurried attention he brought to everything he decided mattered. Both of his hands still cradling her face. The warmth of his mouth against hers, carrying the same quality as the first time she had pressed her palm to his skull in the snow. A recognition that bypassed every careful, analytical system she had built and arrived at its conclusion by a more direct route. Something in her chest that had been braced for a very long time. Braced for impact. Braced for the particular pain of being seen and found insufficient. Released entirely. She kissed him back, and the bond between them, the Pureblood Healer's tie she had rebuilt and he had accepted, and they had been strengthening in 100 quiet moments over weeks of thermal crystals and ward work and courtyard walls and gray eyes finding her in every room she entered, completed itself with the finality of something that had always been meant to close. The snow fell on Winterbane soldiers and Sunfire nobles, and 2 ordinary people kneeling in the mud, and on the crown made of beast fang, resting in a woman's dark hair. And none of it was as cold as it should have been. She thought later, standing at the window of her chambers in the Sunfire Citadel on the first night of a new empire, about what she had understood when Calder had spoken in the Grand Hall 2 months ago in a voice calibrated to wound and had failed, because the wound required a foundation of genuine investment, and she had long since moved hers somewhere safer. She had not known then where safer was. She had only known that the version of her life being offered to her in that hall was insufficient, and that insufficient was not something she was willing to accept without testing the alternative. The alternative had been a blizzard and a monster and 17 thermal dragon crystals, and a man who asked nothing of her except that she look at him when she wanted to observe strength, and who had gone to war for her with the same uncomplicated, total commitment he brought to everything that was his. Because in his accounting, which was not complicated and made no apologies for itself, she was his and he was hers, and the rest was simply logistics. True power was not about forgiving people who had broken you. It was not about returning to prove something to the room that had watched you be discarded and done nothing. It was the courage to burn what needed burning and walk into the dark and the cold with nothing but your own competence and whatever was left of your belief that something on the other side was worth the frost. It was pressing your hand against the skull of the most terrifying thing in the world and choosing to heal it, not because it was safe, but because you were done being safe in ways that were slowly killing you. And sometimes the monster when its eyes cleared, looked at you like you were the only fixed point in a spinning world. And sometimes that was exactly what you had not known you needed, until it was standing in your doorway with ash on its jaw and a fortune in glowing crystals at its feet, because you had mentioned once, offhand, that you were cold. She touched the crown on her head and looked out at the snow. Behind her, Kael's hand came to rest at her shoulder, warm and certain, and she leaned back into that warmth and let herself be still, and the Empire was quiet around them, and the snow kept falling. And she was done running in the most complete and satisfied sense of the phrase. She was exactly where she had walked into a blizzard to find, and she intended to stay. If you enjoyed this satisfying revenge romance story, please like and subscribe for more epic tales of power, passion, and dark romance. Your support means the world and helps us bring you new stories every day.